Welcome to Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue Series, centering healing advocacy and services. The Elevate Uplift project seeks to deepen and broaden the lessons learned from the National Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative project and engage with organizations to change practices and expand their understanding of healing. Elevate Uplift offers opportunities to help survivor-serving agencies, state, territorial, tribal coalitions, and funding administrators to think critically about how they do their work and to make the changes necessary to provide comprehensive and sustainable support for survivors. That includes establishing practices and services rooted in anti-racism and anti-oppression frameworks, learning strategies for building empowering leadership, creating intentional organizational identity, engaging in impactful community organizing and movement building, and expanding knowledge of sexual violence and healing.
Hi everyone, welcome. I wish that I could be with you in person, but amidst the circumstances of navigating multiple pandemics of COVID-19 and racial oppression, working full time and trying to write a book while also caring for my 2-year-old son, and add in moving to the mix. This is the best I can do. So thanks for your grace and your patience. It is such an honor to share with you today and join you for this incredible program. This work is so needed now more than ever. The world needs your voice, the world needs your gifts, and the world needs your healing. And I always say that showing up is the hardest part. This work requires an incredible amount of courage. So I want to just invite you to send yourself a moment of compassion and gratitude for whatever it took to arrive today. And know that I honor each and every one of you for making the commitment to be here, for learning more about this work, and for allowing me to hold space for you today. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Zabie Yamasaki, and I am the founder of an organization called Transcending Sexual Trauma Through Yoga, which is an organization with a very simple mission: empowering survivors to heal through the practice of yoga. In my consulting work, I work for about 25 different universities and trauma agencies and helping them integrate trauma-informed yoga into the scope of their work. I lead 3-day teacher trainings for yoga teachers, mental health professionals, and other healing professionals who want to integrate this modality into the scope of their work. I lead online trainings, and I also work part-time as the program director of trauma-informed programs at UCLA, where I oversee the implementation of an 8-week trauma-informed yoga program for sexual assault survivors, as well as run a number of our alternative healing programs in our Resilience in Your Student Experience Center. So don't ask me when I eat or sleep or do anything else for that matter. But this work is my love, it's my life, it's my passion, and I feel really excited to share with you today. I thought we could just begin with a grounding meditation if that feels comfortable for folks. So I want to just invite you to gently come into your body in a way that feels supportive and accessible for you today. Know that you can keep your eyes open or close them, or maybe find a soft gaze. You're welcome to join from a chair or standing up or whatever feels supportive, safe, and accessible in your body today. And if you'd like, begin to gently come into your beautiful breath. If it feels right in your body, you might invite a palm over your heart and a palm over your belly. Maybe you start to notice the rise and fall of your breath. And know that the choices that you make with your body are always celebrated here. So know if you wanted to find one posture and stay there for the entire practice, that would be perfect and supported. This is your body, your practice, and always your choice. And can you take a moment to maybe drop into this experience of feeling held and supported, knowing that you are never alone in your experience. So many of you are in positions where you are constantly giving of yourself and holding space for others. So maybe just take a moment to allow yourself to feel your own support. Maybe noticing the energy of the earth beneath you. Take all the time you need. No need to constrict your breathing in any way. Find the expansion, find the spaciousness in your own way, on your own terms. Maybe explore with turning the volume of your heart all the way up and the volume of your thoughts all the way down. What does it look like here in our practice to hold the many paradoxes of healing? To honor the grief, but also make space for abundant joy. What does it feel like to honor the waves of healing as they come? What if we could be compassionate with ourselves when we tap into this deep knowing that there may be no finality to this thing called healing? Can we hold on fiercely to our worthiness amidst the many storms that we will inevitably incur in this life? Can we let ourselves be present with moments of relief and of joy, no matter how fleeting they may feel at times? And can we consciously practice self-love? And in the beautiful words of Alex L., we can be whole and still discovering pieces of ourselves. We can be resilient and still sensitive. We can be learning and still making mistakes along the way. We can be growing and still working through grief. We can be healing and still need support. I invite you to breathe all of that in your way, your pace. And then exhale out, maybe relaxing your shoulders down. And if you'd like, feel free to set an intention for your practice today. What do you need a little bit more of in this moment? Peace, strength, energy, time. It's different for each of us. So take a moment to identify what your intention means to you. And know that you can always come back to a mantra or an inner resource or anything that would support you in grounding back into your body. And if at any time being with the internal sensations feels like too much or feels too overwhelming or triggering for your body, maybe explore with focusing on the exteroceptive sensations in the room. Maybe it's a sound or a color, anything that supports you in reorienting back to your body. And as it feels right for you, I invite you to gently sway side to side, slowly bringing some movement back into your body. If it feels accessible, you might explore drawing your chin up in a circular motion. And exhale, maybe circling the chin down towards the body. And again, just moving at a pace that feels right. You can take full circles or half circles. You might even explore bringing your palms to the backs of your shoulders if that feels right or accessible in your body today. Maybe notice any areas of tension that have built up, sending a little extra support there. And continue at a pace that feels right for you. And if you're seated in a chair, you might take some seated twists side to side, maybe bringing your feet to the ground, noticing the support beneath you. Notice what's holding you here. If you'd like, you can bring your right arm to the back of your chair and maybe your left arm to the outside of the chair. On your inhale, I invite you to notice the length in your spine. And exhale, maybe take the gaze over your right shoulder. Twisting only to the degree that feels right in your body. And slowly unwinding, coming back through center, and maybe coming over to the other side. Finding the length in your spine on your inhale. And then exhale, maybe taking the gaze over the left shoulder. Really beautiful expressions, everyone. Take all the time you need. And slowly coming back through center. If it feels right, you could meet me with your palms together at the center of your heart. Hands at your heart, may we live our lives compassionately. Hands at your mouth, may we speak words of truth and of kindness. And hands at your third eye center, the light in me always honors the light in you. Namaste. Thank you all so much for sharing your practice with me today. So, the Yoga as Healing program has really been a fusion of both of my worlds, as I've really been propelled on this journey to learning how powerful yoga can be as a tool for healing trauma. And because of the impact that trauma has on the body's physiology, I feel that we do a huge disservice to survivors by leaving the body out of the equation. And I learned this firsthand for a number of years doing trauma outreach. A large portion of all of my professional roles have entailed giving presentations on trauma. And without a doubt, after every presentation I facilitated, there would be a number of survivor disclosures that followed. And in my numerous conversations with survivors over the years, there's been some pretty consistent themes that have come up. One has been this need to feel something tangible. Survivors wanted to feel like they could regain power and control of their body. They were looking for something tangible to help them manage the painful triggers and the physiological experiences that they were having in their body every single day. And two was just not being quite ready to process their experiences through talk therapy. And I knew that I wanted to create a program that really spoke to the language of the body, because the spectrum of healing is so vast. And what it comes down to really is this need to have multiple pathways to heal. Due to things like stigma around help seeking and cultural barriers and access, it's so critical that we increase these multiple approaches, these multiple pathways to heal. Because, as we all know, and I'm sure deeply understand in the context of our work and our professional roles, not every survivor will heal in the same way. And we were losing too many survivors who weren't coming forward for support because services weren't accessible to their needs. And the program really started as a small seed that I planted. At a really basic level, I wanted to give survivors opportunities for self care. I wanted to give them some tools to help manage their anxiety, manage their depression. But I have been completely overwhelmed and continue to be overwhelmed by the benefits of the practice. There were survivors who, after completing 8 weeks of trauma informed yoga, felt empowered to report their assault if that felt like a safe and accessible option to them. Others who were able to be intimate again with a partner because they felt like they could assertively communicate their boundaries and what they're comfortable with. Many survivors who shared how the program decreased their symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Others who shared that they developed positive coping strategies. And for many, it gave them the opportunity and empowered them to experience things like self love and self compassion for the very first time in their lives. And what I find so critical about the yoga program is that it oftentimes serves as an entry point to getting connected to additional support. So often survivors will start with the trauma informed yoga program and then feel empowered to seek additional resources in their recovery. And to give you some context, in the first quarter that we offered the trauma informed yoga program at UCLA, there were 40 survivors who submitted interest forms to want to participate in the program. And of those 40, only 10 were currently connected to the counseling center or to a survivor advocate in some capacity. So the other 30, this was their first entry point in getting any type of support related to their trauma. And we just cannot continue to send survivors through as you can see on the graph up here, we can't continue to send survivors through these various systems where they are oftentimes being met with folks who do not believe them or who are asking them to repeat their story over and over and over again, which is the opposite of a trauma-informed process. We have to give them some tools to balance their nervous system, to tap into their inner sense of resilience as they move through these various resources that are available to them. I wanted to share a quote from a dear friend and colleague of mine, Molly Bader Harris, who is the founder and executive director of the Breathe Network, which is an incredible organization that connects survivors to holistic healing arts practitioners that offer all of their services on a sliding scale. And she says, in the United States, we have built an incredible crisis advocacy response to survivors of sexual violence, sustained by the relentless dedication and unstoppable passion of advocates and volunteers who have put their bodies, minds, and spirits on the line in a field that requires a 24-hour, 365-day-year commitment. Yet after the advocacy in the emergency room, when the community support group stops meeting, or for those who never had the opportunity or the safety to say the words, "I was raped," aloud, where do survivors turn next as they navigate this sometimes lifelong journey of healing? Where do our advocates and educators, who are so often survivors, turn when the trauma they witness daily starts to merge with the trauma they work so hard to heal? And the line between their trauma and their client's trauma begins to blur. It's time we think more creatively, more holistically, more honestly, and more intentionally about how to best support survivors in healing, move outside of our standard practices and typical referrals to finally meet the body, mind, and spiritual needs of our diverse survivor population. I want to just invite you to take an inhale in And an exhale out. And maybe just start to take note of what came up for you as you heard these words reflected. That last paragraph is really the crux of what we're going to be focusing on today. Today's training is all about helping you integrate trauma-informed yoga into the scope of your work as a yoga teacher, as a mental health professional, as an educator, and to give you the tools to create a safe and comfortable environment for those who you are honored to hold space for. And as yoga teachers, I believe that we have an obligation to be mindful of the way that trauma shows up for our students, the same way we are around physical injuries. We have such a powerful opportunity to support survivors in their recovery, to give them some really concrete tools to manage their stress response and to complete their stress cycle, to help them improve the circulation of energy throughout their nervous system, and most importantly, to help them find and access safety in their bodies again. And I can tell you, having the opportunity to do this work for so many years, there's nothing quite as powerful as being witness to that. So I wanted to begin with a few disclaimers before we jump into any of the lecture today. And I had to begin with one of my favorite quotes by Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I am acutely aware that many of us come to this work with our own experiences of trauma, and that requires us to be extra gentle with ourselves, to know and honor that we don't have to have it all figured out, that we can be honest with ourselves when listening is hard and we need to pause and take a break. The nice thing about this being pre-recorded is you have the option to pause and come back to it at any time. So please honor your body, honor your needs, and be gentle with what you need today. And on a daily basis, we are constantly consuming information that is either adding to balance or imbalance in our lives through the media that we are consuming, through the world that is surrounding us, through our work environments, through our stressors, oh my goodness, navigating life amidst these multiple pandemics. There's so much that we're holding right now. So please honor your story, honor your journey and your unique lived experience. Know that the information I'm sharing today is going to land differently in your body depending on what you're holding. And, I want to be really transparent that I do have a lot of material that I want to share with you, and we only have an hour together. So I want to be mindful of the fact that that might feel really overwhelming at times. So please pause, come back to the material. Know that you can email me and reach out with additional questions that you have. I'm honored to support you in your ongoing learning and your ongoing healing. I also want to shift the paradigm of me as the teacher and you as the student. We are all co-creating and we have so much to learn from one another. A few years ago, I'll never forget, I went to a Bo Forbes training, and she is the author of an incredible book, Yoga for Emotional Balance. And she said, if there's one thing I'm an expert in, it's suffering. And that resonated with me in more ways than I'd like to admit. And Nikki Myers, who does some incredible work with yoga for recovery, always says that there is no hierarchy in healing, especially when we're engaging in trauma-related material. Our lived experience really is our greatest teacher. And so I can't wait to continue to connect with you and learn from you in this ongoing experience, this ongoing learning of being a trauma-informed practitioner. I will be making many references to sexual trauma because that is my specialization, but know that the tools that you'll receive today can really be applied broadly for a number of populations that you might be passionate about working with. So maybe that's working with veterans or working with prison populations. Maybe you feel passionate about working in recovery communities or with cancer survivors. So I hope that you can take these tools and broadly implement them in the scope of your work. And also, if you're able, I would encourage you to have some resourcing materials around you, whether that's essential oil or Play-Doh. I oftentimes have my son's toys near me because Play-Doh and pipe cleaners can actually be really great resourcing tools. Or just, a journal, something that will help you support and ground amidst material that might be triggering or activating. And I love this photo of Rosa Parks. The source is the Library of Congress, and it's a photo of her practicing yoga. If that's not a reminder to care for ourselves, I don't know what is. I've recently been reading the book See No Stranger by Valerie Carr. I highly recommend it. And she says in the book, loving ourselves is frontline social justice work. And so I just want to remind you in ongoing ways to tend to your needs and tend to your care as you learn about trauma work, as you learn about trauma-informed yoga and how this impacts your own healing as well as those that you'll be holding space for. And lastly, I always have this box up here because I just want us to be cognizant of not getting too stuck in this box. Trauma is fluid, and there are so many nuances when it comes to talking about healing from trauma. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. We are always learning, we are always adapting, and really it's making a commitment to continuing to evolve our learning and continuing to evolve our frameworks. And you're not unlearning anything you've learned about yoga up until this point. I want to encourage you to integrate. So really providing survivors with a menu of options and empowering them to choose what best serves them in their journey. And trauma-informed, we'll get into this a little bit later, but I love this definition by Miss Duane, which is trauma-informed is not a buzzword or a strategy. It's a systemic shift in our mindsets, approaches, and our everyday practices. In the compassion that we offer in our classes and the way that we support folks in being seen and how we hold space, it allows every interaction to be a powerful reminder that people are the experts of their own experience, and we are there as a supportive guide to help inspire and empower them with tools that they can choose. All right, so to give you a sense of where we're headed, I'll talk a little bit about excuse me, the neurobiology of sexual trauma and sort of the intersection of yoga. We'll pause and take a little break, and then I'll give a brief overview of what trauma-informed yoga is. So of course, we won't have time to go into all of the frameworks of trauma-informed yoga, but I'll give you sort of a brief overview and then offer some additional training tools if you are interested in that. So I'll jump right in with talking a little bit about the impact of trauma. So trauma is an experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. People oftentimes feel helpless, overwhelmed, scared, horrified. At the core of trauma is horror. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. There are many experiences that may fall under a traumatic event. Trauma is an event that is life-threatening, causes intense fear, compromises one's physical or emotional safety, and can elicit symptoms of PTSD. And also keep in mind that trauma is very subjective and is based on the lived experience of each and every person. So some examples might be, but are certainly not limited to, sexual and domestic violence, racism, and various types of race-based trauma, which we'll talk about in just a bit, microaggressions, systems-induced trauma, intergenerational trauma, neglect, suffering a physical injury or receiving a serious medical diagnosis, school violence, bullying, witnessing or experiencing an automobile, train, or plane crash, experiencing or witnessing a natural disaster, war, combat, or terrorism, being the victim of kidnapping or torture, experiencing a stressful or traumatic life event such as divorce or unemployment, illness, pregnancy or infant loss, or the death of a loved one. I want to just invite you to take an inhale in and an exhale out. And just start to notice what might come up for you as you hear about these different experiences, and be kind and gentle and compassionate with yourself. In the context of sexual violence is one of the most psychologically damaging crimes that any one person can experience. And it's important to know that we can't compartmentalize the way that folks experience trauma. Trauma impacts the whole person, all aspects of their human functioning: the physical, the mental, the behavioral, the social, and the spiritual. And this type of physical and emotional violation to the body oftentimes elicits feelings of intense fear, of powerlessness, and of hopelessness, because what happens is often trauma overwhelms a survivor's internal resources. So all the things that are most important to them, control, connection, and meaning, have become compromised. And the trauma in many ways becomes imprinted on their lived experience. We also have to consider how complex trauma is, and that it does not just encompass sexual trauma, but also trauma from systemic trauma and trauma from discrimination. So we have to be really thoughtful about the intersection between racism, discrimination, bias, and prejudice. Because when someone is being oppressed, that can show up in their body as physical sensations similar to PTSD. It's something known as embodied inequality or race-based trauma. And Dr. Gail Parker talks about how yoga oftentimes helps people of color to experience safety in their vulnerability. And this is a really new learning for folks who might have this experience of ongoing, cumulative, this recurrent nature of racial stress. And people of color need to know what it feels like to rest in ways that feel safe and restorative and nurturing. And when we teach in a trauma-informed way, we can help them start to feel what the absence of stress feels like. And we can create a space for folks to gently unpack all of the messages that they've received around their productivity equating their worth, right? These really harmful messages that all of us receive around rest. And the hope is that rest can become something that's truly restorative instead of taking the form of numbing, checking out, avoiding, or suppressing. And we know that emotional distress has a significant impact on the body. This can lead to sickness, illness, and other physiological symptoms. We know that trauma is a somatic reaction. So often folks are not always registering their trauma as stories, but as these felt physical sensations. That might be in the form of flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, anxious thoughts, migraines, stomach pains, aches and pains. Many survivors may engage in self-harm or develop eating disorders as a means of regaining power and control of their body. And these visceral experiences that we have in the body are a result of our vagus nerve disengaging. So the vagus nerve plays an instrumental role in terms of the expression of emotions in our body. Practicing yoga actually helps to stimulate the vagus nerve, helping us manage a variety of these psychosomatic symptoms, and it's been instrumental in the treatment of major depression. Yoga is one modality of many that helps activate the ventral vagal nervous system, and this can help lead to feelings of connection and safety. The vagus nerve is our 10th cranial nerve, and when we feel safe, the ventral branch of the vagus nerve supports our ability to feel things like rest and calm. And it operates independently of our spinal cord. It wanders from the brainstem to various organs in the body to help calm them down. And it's essentially our rest and digest nerve, and really that interconnection between our gut and our emotional state. And we know that healing from trauma can be a lifelong process. The impact of trauma can linger in the body long after the assault occurred, and it can manifest as a trigger. So, a trigger being a physiological response outside of a survivor's control that reminds them of past trauma. So, if a survivor is undergoing extreme stress, if they experience a flashback or a nightmare, if they see their perpetrator, if they smell a certain cologne or a perfume, or if a yoga teacher places their hands on them without their permission, they can be suddenly placed right back in that experience of trauma as if it's happening in that moment. And in yoga terms, trauma causes something called vasanas. Vasanas are essentially emotional imprints that live in the body. And they oftentimes get deep rooted or hardwired or lodged in various areas of the body depending on the nature of the trauma. This can impact our nervous system. I'll go back to this image actually. Can impact our nervous system, our endocrine system, our physiology. It can cause things like chronic pain, other physical symptoms, or illness. And this quote by Andrea Papin is it's very profound. Anything that reminds us of a previous danger that we have encountered can activate our physiology. And so often, these somatic reenactments of the trauma that people have experienced are survival skills, they're coping mechanisms. And in addition to the physical manifestation of trauma in the body, even the moment a survivor shares their story or talks about their experience, they can also start to experience some of these physiological reactions. And when we experience triggers, we're essentially responding to the present moment as if it's the past. So our body may be misreading the cues, and we have these alarm bells that start to go off. So even if our rational brain knows, I am safe, I am safe, I am safe, from the neck down, our emotional lower brain has a mind of its own. The body does not believe that it's safe. So I wanted to read this small portion of Dr. Peter Levine's book, Waking the Tiger, and it really gives us a glimpse into an individual's experience with trauma. And I will say that it can be very difficult to hear, so please be gentle with yourself, opt out if you need. I don't know of one thing I don't fear. I fear getting out of bed in the morning. I fear walking out of my house. I have great fears of death, not that I will die someday, but that I'm going to die within the next few minutes. I fear anger, my own and everyone else's, even when anger is not even present. I fear rejection and or abandonment. I fear success and failure. I get pain in my chest and tingling and numbness in my arms and legs every day. I almost daily experience cramps ranging from menstrual type cramps to intense pain. I just really hurt most of the time. I have shortness of breath, racing heart, disorientation, and panic. I'm always cold and I have dry mouth. I have trouble swallowing. I have no energy or motivation. And when I do accomplish something, I feel no sense of satisfaction. I feel overwhelmed, confused, lost, helpless, and hopeless daily. I have uncontrollable outbursts of rage and depression. So I want to invite you to take an inhale in and an exhale out. you start to notice your own reactions to this testimonial, you could write them down. You could take note of what you're feeling in your own body in this moment. This is always a really hard testimonial to read, but it's a really true reflection of how a trauma survivor might be moving through the world and the way that their nervous system is compromised, or the invisibility that they feel in their pain and their suffering, and the type of physical and emotional energy that they might be carrying with them to their yoga practice if they have the courage to show up. And it reminds me of a quote that I've heard: people who need help oftentimes look a lot like people who don't need help. And it's why it's so important that we always teach from a trauma-informed lens, that we're always holding the space with compassion and an understanding of the impact that trauma people are carrying in their everyday lives, because we really have the ability to save and change lives just through our supportive presence and the way that we're teaching. And I'm so excited to share more about that with you in just a bit. I wanted to share briefly about the unique experience of sexual assault survivors. This is a testimonial from a survivor that says, "I used to fear public speaking until I had to tell my story to 6 district attorneys, 3 lawyers, 2 defense attorneys, your 2 parents, your girlfriend, 10 mutual friends, 4 judges, 3 police officers, 4 victim advocates, 3 legal interns, 1 residential life director, 5 teachers, 7 relatives, 3 medical professionals, 10 girls you'd sexually harassed before you ever assaulted me, 1 reporter, countless friends for 0 justice. I still have trouble sleeping even 3 years later." This slide sums up for me all of the hoops that survivors have to jump through when getting connected to support. And as I read this, I'm reminded of all of the times that the survivor was not only victimized by sharing their story, but also, again, by the system, oftentimes being met by folks who do not believe them. And again, it really brings to mind how important it is to integrate the body into this process, to not provide healing or support in a compartmentalized way, but integrating the body, mind, soul, and spirit into the healing process. So the numbers speak volumes. The National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey estimates that approximately 53.2 million women and 25.1 million men in the United States have experienced some form of sexual violence over the course of their lifetime. And of course, transgender individuals experience sexual violence at even higher rates. So that's 78.3 million women and men in the US alone. And 70% of adults in the US have experienced some type of traumatic event in their lifetime. So that's 223.4 million people. And I love this quote by Karen Spitz: "If you're teaching yoga, you're teaching trauma survivors." So we must consider that there are multiple students in our classes who've experienced sexual violence or other types of trauma, and as a result have suffered the physical and emotional symptoms that have permeated their lived experience long after the traumas have occurred. And you have the opportunity to empower survivors in their healing process, to remind them about their innate resilience, their innate capacity to heal, to change and save lives through the environment that you create in your classes, or by the way you integrate this modality into the scope of your own profession. And I think so much of what we're doing is helping students hold their gifts and their wounds at the same time, to really honor that process, to remind them that they can grieve and they can also thrive, that we can be multiple things. We can hold multiple complex emotions and feelings in our body, but that healing is our innate right. And when we teach from a trauma-informed lens, we create the space where people can begin to heal and can begin to really know that this is their innate right. I won't spend too much time going over these victim blaming responses, but there are a few that I wanted to mention because I wanted you to have a sense of how survivors oftentimes internalize these various victim blaming responses. And it gives you an idea of the layers of emotional trauma that they're already carrying: the self blame, the lack of trust, the lack of control, the fear, the minimization of their experiences, the isolation. And what I think is the most damaging is this notion that it's not okay to feel the way that I feel. So often, folks will say things to survivors after they disclose to them, like, why didn't you run away? Or why didn't you fight back harder? And oftentimes, folks will talk about the fight or flight response, but very rarely do you hear folks talk about freeze. And this is happening in nearly 50% of rape cases, according to Rebecca Campbell's research, where folks experience something known as tonic immobility or rape induced paralysis. And this is when, during an assault, a survivor becomes physically frozen and unable to move, oftentimes out of fear that they may be further harmed or killed. And so when people say things like, why didn't you run away? Or why didn't you fight back harder? Of course, it completely minimizes the experience of the survivor and makes them feel like they actually could have done more to prevent the assault from happening to them, leading to further blame and minimization of their experiences. I wanted to talk a little bit about PTSD, which is anything but linear. So I'm sorry if it presents that way, but I did want you to have a sense of the various symptom clusters that folks can experience. The first is arousal. So somebody may be reliving the traumatic event. They may have nightmares, flashbacks, persistent episodic recollections of their traumatic experiences. They may experience numbing, so a lack of interest in things, a loss of emotional tone, avoidance of addressing their feelings, or, sort of like, I already dealt with it. This is where dissociation is common. Dissociation is an out of body experience where somebody disengages from their body, oftentimes because trauma has overwhelmed their nervous system. They may experience avoidance and just general feelings of isolation. And finally, vigilance, where they may have increased anxiety, they may feel on guard easily or easily startled. And it's PTSD if it's persistent for 1 month or longer and related to some type of traumatic event. If it's less than 1 month, it's often known as acute stress disorder. And keep in mind that dissociation really is the essence of trauma. It is a strategy to leave the body. So the overwhelming experience, just like you can see in this description over here of this from Shauna Underwood of their recollection with PTSD, the overwhelming experience is fragmented. So emotions, sensory information, sounds, images, physical sensations related to the trauma start to take on a life of their own. A traumatic event may have a beginning and an end. At some point, it may be over. But for people with PTSD, a flashback can occur at any time, whether they're awake, whether they're asleep. There's no way of knowing how long the flashback will last. And PTSD is really the body's way of telling us that we have this undigested sensory residue that really wants to be processed. So those vasanas that live in the body, those emotional imprints that really need to be processed. Okay, so I think we will pause here for a moment and take a little break, and we'll resume in about 5 minutes. Okay, everyone, welcome back. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of trauma on the brain because I think it really helps to give a holistic scope of the survivor experience. And I know we were just talking about sort of symptomology and the physiological impact of PTSD. And I love this quote from Dr. Jen Hardy: when we begin to understand that much of what we think of as symptoms are actually survival strategies, we make space for compassion and healing. And I think the more we can share this message with survivors, and it creates less shame around all the ways that their body has fought for them, that their body has helped them survive through these various survival strategies, through these various coping mechanisms. And there is a plethora of research out there that talks about the impact of trauma informed yoga, trauma sensitive yoga on the nervous system, on helping folks really get into their window of tolerance, which we're going to talk about in just a bit. So, if you're interested in learning more about what the research says and getting a sense of these different studies, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to link you to them. So, the amygdala is the part of our brain that is responsible for keeping us safe. It is sort of our emotional control center. It's responsible for the fight, flight, and again, the one that folks oftentimes leave out, the freeze response. The impact of trauma on the amygdala is it's constantly keeping it in overdrive. So it's constantly identifying danger and threat, even when danger and threat may not be present. Remember, anything that we sense as a threat can activate our physiology. So, this is one of the reasons why many trauma survivors may live in a constant state of fear and anxiety, and why resting can be difficult when they're constantly living in states of hyperarousal. It's really exhausting and scary to not know the difference between safety and danger. The hippocampus is the part of our brain that is responsible for the formation of new memories, new concepts, and new skills. And the way that these two intersect during trauma is that when the amygdala is constantly searching for imminent threat, the hippocampus gets flooded with cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And this is what can make it so challenging for survivors oftentimes to recall certain memories associated with their trauma. The best visual I can give you is if you can imagine that you had post-it notes all on your desk in sequential order. And somebody came over and they wiped those post-it notes away. They crumpled some, they hid some in drawers, they threw some in the trash can. This is oftentimes what's happening to the memories that survivors have associated with their trauma. They become incredibly fragmented. And during traumatic stress, the speech center can shut down. And this is what makes it so difficult for survivors oftentimes to articulate what happened to them in words, and why having body based interventions or multiple pathways and forms of expression in the healing process is so critical, and especially having somatic interventions and talk therapy. So, I really love talking about the window of tolerance. During trauma, the nervous system can become very reactive, as we've talked about, in order to respond to a real or to a perceived threat. But even if the threat is not real, it can still send our bodies into a frenzy. And trauma can push us into states of hyperarousal where we might experience increased sensations, flooded emotional reactivity, hypervigilance. But what's the problem with that? If we're constantly living in states of hyperarousal, it's exhausting, right? It's exhausting. Adrenal fatigue. Our bodies are not designed to constantly live in these states of hyperarousal. And the way that can manifest in the body is by sending us into states of hypoarousal, whether that's depression, isolation, flat affect, dissociation, numbing. And our adrenals regulate the levels of cortisol in our bodies. And adrenal fatigue can occur essentially when our system is working in excess. So I'm sure many of us can relate to that right now. I know it's taking everything for me to work from home full time, to care for a young child, to tend to the needs of those who I'm holding space for, to take in the news of constant racial oppression and the news about COVID-19 and feeling helpless, right? Sometimes it makes even seemingly small tasks feel insurmountable in nature. And practicing trauma informed yoga is one modality of many that can help soothe the nervous system, that can help bring us into this state, into this window of tolerance, into this yellow portion as you see up here on the image. And when we're in our window of tolerance, we feel good. We can perhaps make informed decisions about what we need. We might be able to access clarity. It can help us be attuned to really this experience physiologically of moving in and out of states of dysregulation and really paying attention to the practices that are harming us versus the practices that are helping us. I know for me, the biggest trigger that I'm outside of my window of tolerance is that I become incredibly irritable. So my partner will say, honey, your empathy meter is in the red. That's what he typically says to me. And that's when I know, okay, I need to tend to my practice. I need to say no to this. I need to set boundaries and really having a toolkit of things that I know is going to help me get closer back to that window of tolerance. And so I invite you to sit with this. I think it's a really helpful diagram also to use with clients to do some psychoeducation about what does it mean to listen to the needs of your body and respond in ways that feel kind and compassionate. And what does that look like as an ongoing practice? And I think that's really an incredible baseline to continue to do the work. And I also encourage you, something that I love doing is incorporating assessment into my trauma informed yoga programs and classes. And so it could even be an arousal scale, it could be a baseline card of inviting students to tell you where are they on this scale of hyperarousal, window of tolerance, hypoarousal, or how are they doing? What are they feeling in their bodies prior to the practice? And what are they feeling after the practice? Because then you'll really get a sense, is the practice helping them or is it harming them? And how can you use that as a tool and an ongoing way to support that client or to support that survivor? So I really encourage you to get creative with how you're inviting feedback and assessment into your program or into your offerings. And I'm sure we all can relate to being in this state, right? Where the nervous system just feels fried, where if one more person comes to us or asks us for something, or even, something that appears to be reasonable can be met. Sometimes I feel like I have fire coming off of my body because my system is totally working in excess. And really, wanting to help survivors and help ourselves get to this place in an ongoing way, which is really self-care as an everyday practice. Okay, so what does trauma informed actually mean? Oftentimes the word trauma informed really gets thrown around as a buzzword, but I wanted us to feel grounded in what the term means, where it comes from, and how it can be applied to multiple settings within the scope of our work. And keep in mind that trauma does influence how folks approach and respond to services, which is why it's so essential for those who are in support roles of supporting survivors of trauma or sexual assault to recognize the various expressions of trauma, to be able to note that and to acknowledge the role that it plays in people's lives, in the way that they move through the world and who they interact with, who they trust, who they feel safe with. The goal ultimately with trauma informed care is to support the healing and growth of survivors, to prioritize that, and at all costs to avoid re-traumatization. And implementing, as we've talked about, implementing trauma-informed care really is more of a philosophy and a skill set. It's a way of truly seeing people and honoring their humanity. Its underlying philosophy is actually grounded in early grassroots and survivor-centered models of Black and Brown feminists who were on the ground doing frontline justice work and putting survivors at the center of their own experience. And it's now being widely applied to a number of mental health, advocacy, and medical settings. And what I find so powerful about the framework is it not only understands the impact of trauma on survivors, but also on communities and those that serve them. So, really working to build strong, healthy, resilient organizations that focus on collective and community care. Some of the core components of trauma informed care are safety, trust, choice, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural competence. And I really love this model from SAMHSA, which is the 4 Rs. So, a trauma informed approach realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths of recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved within the system, responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and of course, at all costs, resists re traumatization. So, asking survivors to share their story over and over again, or creating additional unnecessary barriers in the support process. Important note, many survivors do report that they experience victimization during the disclosure, reporting, or help seeking process, but there's incredible research that has found that many programs have found that survivors who are uncomfortable with or express a lack of interest in talk therapy have actually flourished in art or movement-based formats. So essentially, trauma informed yoga is an empowering yoga practice that prioritizes the lived experience and healing of each and every student, of each and every survivor. Safety, trust, choice, and control are some of the core components of the practice. So essentially, you're taking that framework of trauma informed care and applying that to yoga spaces. And I love this quote from Dr. Thema. Those of you who don't follow her work is incredible. Trauma survivors are always preparing for the door to close, for the ball to drop, for disaster to strike. In healing, we learn to experience joy, rest, and safety. And I think that that's such a beautiful description of the impact that trauma informed yoga can have on the healing process of survivors. And we're coming to a close today, but I did just want to leave you with some of the frameworks of what trauma informed yoga actually entails. So, empowerment based language is what I believe to be the core component of trauma informed yoga. We're essentially using language as transformation. And it's essentially the difference between giving a direct instruction versus offering the experience to go inward for someone to explore their own internal landscape and their own sense of safety. And I love words. I love thinking about our language. So I've included a few here. Some examples of that are the choices that you make with your body are always celebrated here. You are always in control of your practice. You are your greatest teacher. I invite you to send yourself gratitude just for arriving to your mat today. So often that's the hardest part. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on your journey and how far you've come. Inhale and exhale at your pace. And, I think that so much of what we're doing in trauma informed yoga is grounding people in their own worthiness, of reminding them that rest is something to be celebrated, of helping them unpack all of these societal and internal messages that they're receiving around their worth and letting them know that they're enough exactly as they are. All of you is welcome here. Today, explore what taking up all of the space you deserve. You have many options to explore what rest looks like for you. So that might be in the context of a trauma-informed shavasana, and really offering multiple options for folks to rest, especially with so many triggers associated with PTSD and the freeze response and darkness and not knowing where the yoga teacher is in the room. Thinking about always having a consent protocol. So there are many ways to communicate your comfort level with assess. I honor your choices and you can change your mind at any time. And some of these you already heard me share within the scope of our practice today. I've written out these compassionate phrases to help ease the survivor's nervous system. So you might even think about integrating some of these phrases into your work, saying things like, there's no rush, take all the time you need. Your resilience inspires me. Thank you for trusting me. I see the light in you. Your journey is brave. You are worthy of gentleness, kindness, and peace. It's okay to rest and go slow. Your needs matter. What happened to you is not your fault. I am not alone in this experience. I am worthy of rest. I will not doubt my power and my value. I deserve to live with ease. So these are just examples for you to begin thinking about your own work and how you can shift your language and really make it more accessible and supportive for survivors. For those of you who might be mental health professionals or educators and thinking about integrating this work into the scope of what you do, it's absolutely possible. You don't have to have a 200-hour certification. There's so many grounding tools and affirmations that you can integrate into a therapeutic scope of practice. You might say something like, would you like to try a new approach to help calm that revved up feeling that you're experiencing in your body? Amy Weintraub, who does a lot of great training for yoga skills for therapists, has a lot more language around that. So it might even be beginning your therapy session with a centering practice or setting an intention followed by a grounding meditation and maybe letting that guide the flow of the session. Maybe it's doing seated sun salutations together if that's something that feels accessible. It could be ending each therapy session with a safe visualization or a way to kind of create that container to close out the session and help that client or that survivor feel a little more resourced. So let me go back. Sorry, I could talk about this all day. Thinking about the accessibility of your practice. How are you creating access for folks who can't sit on a yoga mat? Are there chairs available? Are there gender neutral bathrooms? Is there signage that makes the space feel welcoming and accessible? So there's so many factors to consider that we talk about in the larger trauma-informed yoga training. If you're interested, sorry, my dog is in the background. Give me just a second. Okay, so thinking about your own supportive presence, about your own practice of caring for yourself and tending to your needs. So much of the work that we do as trauma-informed practitioners is acknowledging our own care, is acknowledging that we do a real disservice when we're doing the work from a place of feeling overwhelmed or feeling burnt out. And so I feel like supportive presence is the way that we authentically step into the space every time that we teach. And sometimes for me, that's doing a meditation in my car before I know I'm going to be holding space in a very immense way. Sometimes that's really honoring my capacity and saying no to other things so I have more energy to give. There's so many ways that we talk about our own supportive presence and tending to that in an ongoing way in the training. We talk about sensitivity to triggers. So, really noticing, how do we know if somebody is experiencing a trigger? And what are some things that we can do to help folks work through triggers that might be arising for them in the yoga class? Sometimes that's offering the option of thinking about an internal resource or thinking about an intention or thinking about certain postures that feel safe to them that they can come back to if they ever start to feel something activating or triggering happening in the scope of their practice. So we talk all about what are some ways that you can tend to triggers that might be arising for survivors. We talk about the safety of the physical space, thinking about things like props or lighting. For many survivors whose trauma involved being bound, seeing straps hanging from the wall can be incredibly triggering. So we talk about various ways to create safety and access within the physical space. There are so many triggers related to breath for survivors, for those who might have been holding their breath, experiencing suffocation. Um, you might have noticed in the breath cues that I offered, it's really about breathing in ways that feel safe and accessible to that student. So not offering any sort of constricting breathing. And if you are offering specific breath practices, I always encourage to really offer multiple tools and always offer choice within your various offerings. We talk all about consent positive assist and having a consent framework around touch, the ethics of that, whether it's offering yoga flip chip or offering consent stones. Most importantly, always asking for permission. I will be honest, I do not offer physical assists in my trauma-informed yoga classes. The majority of classes that I am teaching are closed to trauma survivors. So that's always just a policy that I let them know up front. But for those of you who might be teaching in community classes or who might be integrating this into the scope of your work, within the trauma-informed training, we talk about all the various nuances involved around physical assists. Of course, we cannot call ourselves trauma-informed practitioners without also adopting an anti-oppression lens. So we talk about the history of yoga, the roots of yoga. We talk about how to create access for marginalized populations who have traditionally felt left out of the conversation, and how do we continue to do this work in ongoing ways. And of course, tending to our own self and community care amidst it all, which I think is a theme that has come up multiple times throughout our session today. So sorry that I rushed through that at the end. I am just so honored to connect with you. Please feel free to reach out to me. Let me see if I have my email up on here. Okay, so my website is zabieyamasaki.com. zabieyamasaki.com. So that has all of the information about how to connect with me, about the virtual offerings. I'd love to continue to connect with you and learn with you. I am writing a book called Trauma Informed Yoga for Survivors of Sexual Assault that will be published by Norton in, fingers crossed, 2021. And I share a lot on social media, so please feel free to follow me at Transcending Trauma with Yoga. And I have just really enjoyed this time with you today. I wish I could be with you live, but please feel free to reach out to me and let me know ways that I can continue to support you. And it's an honor to have you in the space today. Thank you so much.
You've been listening and viewing Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue series. Elevate Uplift is supported by a collective of national organizations and Circle of Wisdom members leading anti-sexual violence work and includes the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, the National Organization of Asians and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the Resource Sharing Project, and our Circle of Wisdom members who provide us with direction, expertise, connections, and influence. For more information, please visit www.elevateuplift.org.